Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, why don't I wait for a minute? Today, we've only got 6 people today. I mean, this is getting quite silly. Let me wait for a few minutes, and then if anyone comes. Okay, so let's get started. I sent you the recordings from last week. Today we're going to be talking about Mill, trying to finish off Mill, and if we have time, we're going to start talking about Nietzsche. And I think Mill offers a sort of bridge between Hegel and Nietzsche. So there are certainly some Hegelian elements in Mill's philosophy, some elements I think are sort of characteristic of the 19th century, and I'll point to them. And then the sort of towards the end of the chapter on liberty, we get this sort of contrast between something like a sort of Protestant ethics of self-denial and a pagan ethics of self-assertion. That we've got these two different modes, the sort of saying no and the saying yes. And I think when it comes down to this sort of struggle, this division between Protestant self-denial and pagan self-assertion, Mill is with Nietzsche. Yeah, so one of the things that Mill is sort of advocating for is a sort of political philosophy that is closer to, based on these sort of pagan virtues of self-affirmation, rather than the Christian virtues of self-denial. And I think this kind of contrast between the sort of ethics, the Christian ethics, and there are, I think for Nietzsche and for Mill, a sort of ethics of self-denial, and then this kind of ethics of the future, which is going to be an ethics of self-affirmation. I think this is why I think there are affinities between Mill and Nietzsche. Okay, so that's how I've got Mill in here. There's going to be some Hegelian, some stuff with Hegel at the beginning, and then towards the end, we're going to see the way in which self-affirmation and pluralism. And Mill himself, one of the things that Nietzsche is going to argue for in the genealogy of morals is what he calls a revaluation of values. Yeah, and one of the things that Nietzsche believes in is the importance of creators of new values. Yeah, and so the importance of individuals who create values. And this is something that's going to be central to Mill at the end. So he finishes off chapter 3 talking about the importance of genius, and in some sense the importance of creators of new values. So I think there are real affinities between Nietzsche and Mill. And I think, Hegel thinks that every philosopher reflects their age in thought. And I think Nietzsche and Mill are sort of expressions of very much this sort of Victorian modernism with a sort of pagan pluralistic twist to it. So that's my take. Hold on, I'm going to change my glasses because these ones are the wrong strength for looking at the screen. So what I want to do now is I want to look through Mill. Last class I was looking at Bentham, and I was talking about Bentham's utilitarianism, and someone asked me, said, "Oh, we've seen all this stuff, isn't it stupid and crazy?" And I think kind of that sort of Mill's attitude, I think, to classical utilitarianism. So I think Mill is not, even though he invented the term and he wrote a book called Utilitarianism, in many ways Mill is not a utilitarian. He's much closer to a sort of Aristotelianism. Yeah, of course, happiness, eudaimonia, is going to be central to his philosophy, but it's not going to be understood as something that can be quantified. Yeah, and I think one of the things that's important about Mill, and this is on page. Well, let me work through it. So let's start on page 74. So remember, last class we were talking about, or I was talking about start on liberty, and Mill sort of tells this historical story. So according to this historical story, that in the past people used to clamor to limit state power to protect the people. Oh, is my internet a bit bad at the moment? Should I go to my phone internet? Any? Okay, let me do that. It should just take.
I think you're on mute.
Yes. So Mill tells this story about how in the past the people struggled for freedom against the state. Then you had the rise in the modern period of democratic politics. And then the kind of main goal became not to limit state power, but for the people to gain state power. So he said, however, a time came in the progress of human affairs when men ceased to think it a necessity of nature that their governors should be an independent power, opposed in interest to themselves. It appeared to them much better that the various magistrates of the state should be their tenants or delegates, revocable at their pleasure. So you had this rise of modern democracy, of popular power, and the sort of idea that the power of the people should be limited, this sort of disappeared. And so I think he's thinking about people in the 18th century. So if you look at sort of 18th century Republicans, people like Rousseau, yeah, the sort of reading of Rousseau as a radical Democrat who thinks that if the state expresses the will of the people, there should be no limit to the power of the state. And I think Mill thinks that theoretically you can see why people thought that, but he thinks that he says on page 75, he says in politics and philosophical theories, as well as persons, success discloses faults and infirmities which failure may have concealed from observation. So he thinks that in some sense, in terms of politics, like Hegel, he's got this idea that we have to learn from experience. And there are certain kind of problems that one only realizes when a theory is put into practice. Yeah. So political theory isn't so much, or isn't just a matter for Mill of abstract theorizing, but there's a sort of element of experimental knowledge. Yeah, that we may think of political history as a sort of set of experiments about how lives may be lived collectively. Yeah, but I think this is a view of political history, of political theory as involving practical experiments. It's a sort of view that I think you find in Hegel, but this is very central to Mill's view. I think if you look at the rise of political philosophy developed in Greece. And one reason I think political theory, political philosophy, and history developed in Greece is you had lots of small city-states. Yeah, so in the East, you had the empires. In Greece, you had all of these different city-states, and each city-state experimented with forms of government. So what you found in ancient Greece were a bunch of political experiments. Yeah, and the Greek historians were able to compare the successes and failures of various forms of government. And so I think Mill, like Hegel, thinks that political philosophy, political theory can't be purely abstract, yeah, but it involves engaging in sort of political experiments. And this idea that political philosophy involves experimentation is also going to be applied to ethics. So in political philosophy, I think like Hegel, he says the notion that people have no need to limit their power over themselves may seem axiomatic when popular government was a thing only dreamed about or read about as having existed at some distant period in the past. So the idea of limits on popular government, when the idea of popular government was just an idea, the idea of it being limited didn't seem obvious. Yep. But now, through experience, I think he thinks to see that once a democratic republic came to occupy a large portion of the Earth's surfaces and made itself one of the most powerful members of the community of nations, then we can see that these negative sides of popular government aren't just historical aberrations, but in principle, we can come to learn through experience empirically that in principle, popular governments need to have their power limited. Yeah. So through experience, we've learned that when you have democratic societies, we've got to be worried about the tyranny of the majority. And this tyranny, or this worry about tyranny, I'm going through what we said last time, that we've got to worry about the tyranny of the state acting as a kind of organized expression of popular power. But he's more worried about, so he says, its means of the people, its means of tyrannizing are not restricted to the acts by which it may do by the hands of its political functionaries. Yeah, but society can and does execute its own mandates. Yeah, and this is done through things like popular opinion. Yeah, so I think in the UK, he thinks that the laws in the UK or in Britain at the time were fairly liberal, but you had a quite conservative religious society where the tyranny of public opinion limited the lives of individuals. Yeah, and so this is what he's worried about. So now, what are the basis of his liberalism? So I think one thing that's central to Mill's approach is that he's a utilitarian. Yeah, he thinks that ultimately in political philosophy we should appeal to happiness or people living their life well, or what someone like Aristotle may have thought of as eudaimonia. Yeah, so when it comes to choosing political institutions and trying to change the political institutions, our criteria ultimately has to be human flourishing. But unlike Aristotle and more like Hegel, Mill thinks that we don't have a sort of atemporal a priori understanding of what it is to have a flourishing life. Yeah. So what is it to have a good life? This is a question that we can only answer partially. And as we experience more, and as we engage in more experiments in living, our understanding of what it is to have a successful, flourishing human life develops. Yeah. So there's not just progress in terms of so Mill appeals to what he calls our interests, human beings' interest as a progressive being. And Mill thinks that we don't just make progress in scientific knowledge, but we can also make progress in moral knowledge. And so through experiments in living, we can learn more and more about what are the elements, what it is to lead a good life. Now, and so I think there's so at the beginning of this chapter, starting on page 77, he's talking about what guides individuals in making their judgments about others. And he thinks that each individual, so I'm going to use the language of John Rawls, he thinks that each individual has their own sort of conception of the good. And then individuals try and impose their conception of the good on others. So normally when it comes to making judgments about political policy, Mill thinks that we have a tendency to have some conception of what it is to have a good life. And then we apply this and use this as our criterion for public policy. And Mill, like Hegel, is going to argue that our individual conceptions of the good, our individual consciences, are basically subjective. So remember, in Hegel, he has these three sections: abstract right, morality, and ethical life. And the high point of morality is going to be the emergence of the Protestant Kantian idea of conscience. So we each have this conscience we must appeal to, and each one of us has our own internal judgment about what's right and what's good. We each have our own conception of what makes life good. And Mill, like Hegel, I think, agrees with this and thinks that our conception of the good is subjective and is normally an expression of our time and the customs we've been brought up with. And so a particular conception of the good isn't going to be adequate, he thinks, to regulate social life. So he thinks that in some sense, the state and society should be neutral about questions of what it is to lead a good life. And it should leave this decision up to individuals. So each individual should be left to decide how to lead their lives and what conception of the good to follow. And Mill doesn't think this because he thinks there's no truth about what it is to lead a good life. He thinks that objectively some lives are better than others. He thinks objectively human beings can flourish or they can live miserably. He thinks it's better to live in a free liberal democracy than to be a slave, for example. Being a slave is objectively bad because a slave isn't able to flourish. So Mill, in arguing that individual conceptions of the good are subjective in some sense, is not denying that is not denying the possibility of truth. That he thinks that they're subjective, but there's going to be a sort of each of our conceptions of the good is going to have some truth to it, but it's all going to be. Mill says that when it comes to individuals, this is on page 77, the practical principle that guides them to their opinions on the regulation of human conduct is the feeling in each person's mind that everyone should be required to act as he. And those with whom he sympathizes would like them to act. No one indeed acknowledges to himself that his standard of judgment is his own liking, but an opinion on a point of conduct not supported by reasons. But an opinion on a point of conduct not supported by reasons can only count as one person's preference. Yeah. And if the reasons, when given, are a mere appeal to similar preferences felt by other people, it is still only a matter of people's liking, many people's liking instead of one. So our conception, we have individual preferences about how to lead our lives. And we take these individual preferences as sort of objective, and then we try and force them on others. Yeah, this is what I think living in where we're living, we're aware of this sort of behavior. People have certain ideas about how to lead their lives, and then they punish other people for not living the same life. And Mill thinks that yeah, we've got this standard of judgment, and the standard of judgment we appeal to our own liking, one person's preference. Yeah, these are all in some sense subjective. So he says, to any ordinary man, however, his own preference thus supported is not only a perfectly satisfactory reason, but the only one he generally has for any of his notions of morality, taste, or propriety. So once again, this should strike you as very Hegelian. Yeah, the idea that we each have these individual preferences. These preferences are sort of subjective. Yeah, and for most of us, our judgments of morality, taste, and propriety are just an expression of our subjective preferences and liking. And these preferences generally come from the society in which we live. Yeah, so he says, wherever there is an ascendant class, yeah, a large proportion of the morality of the country emanates from its class interests and its feeling of class superiority. Yeah, so you have different societies, you have emergence of different social classes, and the morality of the society tends to reflect, Mill thinks, the morality of the sort of dominant class. So in the 18th century, in the 17th century, you had a sort of aristocratic society, and the moral code of the society was a sort of aristocratic moral code. And then in the Victorian era, you have the sort of rise of modern capitalism, and the sort of morality of 19th century Britain tended to be this morality of modern capitalism that stressed, for example, the importance of hard work. Yeah, so if you're an aristocrat like Aristotle, what do you think of work? What did Aristotle think of work? Anyone know? Aristotle thought work is a very bad idea. That's why you have slaves. Work is bad. Yeah, that work is something that is for slaves. and that yeah, it's a bad thing. By the 19th century, you have this sort of re-evaluation of work. This is something that you find in the emergence of Protestantism, actually. This is Weber's theory about the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism, that in the Protestant tradition, you have this idea that work is something that is an expression of your faith. And by the 19th century, we've got a sort of ethics that values work, industry, certain form of public propriety. Within aristocratic culture, there was more of a sort of evaluation of eccentricity. In the modern world, you may think there's a sort of valuation of hard work, industry, and a type of uniformity. Yeah, that you have to get up, you go to work, everyone wears the same uniform. You know, it's yeah. And so Mill thinks that wherever there's an ascendant class, so we tend to get our values from the community in which we're raised up, and the values of a community. So our values are subjective, but they tend to be an expression of the community, and the values of a community tend to express the values, the interests of a particular class. So, for example, we have between Spartans and Helots, between planters and Negroes, yeah, between princes and subjects, between men and women, yeah, and you know that one thing about these moral codes is partially they express tradition about how to live well, but our moral codes we find ourselves born into very often aren't kind of codes about how to live well, but they sort of encode class domination. Yeah, so you know that laws that absolutely protect property and the value of property, you might think are for the benefit of those in society that have property. Mill was one of the first defenders, public advocates of votes for women, and he was one of the early kind of Victorian feminist writers, together with his partner Harriet Watt, and he's got a book on the subjugation of women, and so he thinks that the moral codes about gender relations aren't necessarily there for they're not always codes about what tend to allow you to have a good life, but they're partially there because you're living in a society that is male dominated, and the codes are partially there to protect this domination. So yeah, so this is his theory about where individual conceptions of the good come from. He says the likings and dislikings of society, or of some powerful portion of it, and that's the main thing which has practically determined the rules laid down for general observance under the penalties of law or opinion. And yeah, so Mill thinks in some sense that we each have a kind of conception of what it is to have a good life. These conceptions of what it has to have a good life tend to come from the society in which we live in. And these rules partially have to do with centuries of wisdom about how to live well. But many of the rules and regulations have got to do with oppression and domination by the sort of dominant classes within society. So laws about property protect owners, laws about subordination, norms about subordination of men to women protect yeah. And so Mill thinks that rather than struggling to try and impose our conception of the good on others, progressive members of society should instead struggle for a society that allows individual members to lead lives as they choose fit and to develop their own individual conceptions of the good. So he wants to argue for, he argues for this harm principle, that this is on page 80. So I read this last time, I'm not going to read it again, but he says the object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle. And the principle is that the only end for which mankind is justified in interfering with the liberty of any of their number is self-protection. Yeah, that the only legitimate concern that the state or society has in the lives of individuals is to stop them harming other people, other members of the society. That the society and others shouldn't get involved in making judgments about how what constitutes a good life for other people. Yeah, individuals should be allowed and encouraged to make those decisions themselves. So there's an interesting discussion about how such a principle is only going to work for societies that are have reached a certain state of maturity. So this is a norm that is going to be applicable in certain societies, not in others. So and I take it the sort of thought here is that there are certain preconditions for such a liberal society. So you might think in a liberal democracy, for example, individuals are going to have some sort of capacity to inform themselves. So you might think that until you've got mass literacy, having a sort of liberal society isn't going to be possible. So he thinks that, like Hegel, he thinks that the sort of norms and the sort of rules that govern a society are going to have to be appropriate to the stage of development of the society. So he has a sort of historicist view about appropriate forms of political evaluation. He's a sort of bit of a Kemalist. He thinks that he says he says despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting that end. Liberty as a principle has no application to any state of things anterior to or prior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. So liberty, freedom, the sort of freedom that Mill is advocating, he thinks is only going to be appropriate in societies in which people have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. And I think he thinks there are sort of minimal requirements you have here. So you have things like mass literacy. If you think free and open discussion is something that takes place, for example, through the press, then you're only going to have a society in which free and open discussion is going to improve people when you've got a society in which the vast majority of people can read and write. Yeah, so there are going to be sort of minimal requirements. And so he thinks before society has got to this stage, there's nothing for them but implicit obedience to an Akbar or Charlemagne if they are so fortunate as to find one. But as soon as mankind have attained the capacity of being guided to their own improvement by conviction or persuasion, liberty is the appropriate principle. So, you know, Mill used to work for the East India Company. So partially, I think this is a justification of English colonialism in India. You know, like, oh, the Indians aren't capable of governing themselves. So us Englishmen have to govern them, yeah, until they've grown up. Yeah, now, I don't know what you kind of, yeah, at the same time, I think this is also the sort of reasoning that you find in some early Kemalists, yeah, that, we want a democratic society, but before we get there, we've got to kind of go out and educate the peasants. Yeah, and we need a period of sort of education, maybe a period of slight despotism in order to get society to the stage where the people are capable of governing themselves. I think this sort of rhetoric is sort of difficult because, you know, if you're a parent, you're never going to think that your child is really grown up enough to govern themselves. Yeah, so you might, you know, like, oh, you might think, oh, he's not ready yet. Yeah, so I think this is the sort of rhetoric that can sort of be used to justify colonialism and sort of despotism for too long. So I think one thing is that one political philosopher I like is Philip Pettit, and he's one of the kind of people who, after Rawls, I think the big kind of move after Rawls is a form of sort of neo-republicanism. So he defends this neo-republicanism where he has this, advocates an ideal of freedom as non-domination. If you're interested, he's one of the most influential political philosophers. There's lots of YouTube videos. So if you're interested in political philosophy and you haven't heard of Philip Pettit, he's someone to follow. And he has this idea of responsibilization. So he thinks if you've got a child and you want them to become responsible, in some sort of sense, the only way they're going to become responsible is by treating them as if they're responsible, even if maybe they're too young for this. Yeah, so you have beings who are sort of responsibilizable. Yeah, and I take it when it comes to the possibility of self-government, that to govern yourselves is difficult and it takes time. And I think when you've got a group of people who've never governed themselves, who try to do it, it's all a bit of a mess and chaotic. But the only way you get to govern yourselves is by going through that chaos. Yeah, the idea that we should wait, the idea that you should wait until you're ready to govern yourselves, I guess you're never going to end up governing yourselves, because unless you sort of try and fail and mess up, you're not going to do it. Yeah, so self-government, I think you learn to be self-governing by trying to govern yourselves collectively. And groups that first start doing that, it's very messy. And over time, you develop institutions and ways of doing it. I think, yeah, I mean, I think in principle, I think Mill's sort of right, that the possibility of having a liberal society presupposes a certain level of education. You need certain institutions. I mean, if you're living in a society like America, where you've just got Fox News, constant propaganda, self-government, you've got lack of education. So a certain sort of level of education. Anyway, this is Mill's idea, and his argument for it. Yeah, so he says, I forego any advantage which could be derived to my argument from the ideal of abstract right. So there are some philosophers who appealed to the idea of rights, basic human rights. And Mill, coming from this utilitarian tradition, rejects the idea of human rights. Yeah, Bentham, his godfather, did people know what Bentham very famously said about rights and talk of rights? He said it's nonsense on stilts. You know, stilts, those sticks that a clown walks on to make themselves higher. You know what a stilt is? I'll write it down in the chat because I'm not sure if you understand my pronunciation. Nonsense on. Nonsense on stilts. What do you call stilts in Turkish? You know, you have a clown and they've got some sticks they're walking on to make themselves higher. Yeah, I've seen clowns in Turkey on stilts, so I know that stilts exist in Turkey, but I just don't know what they're called. Yeah, so Bentham, like Mill, that he rejects any sort of discourse that appeals to fundamental human rights. Yeah, because he thinks that rights, and talks about rights and justice independent of flourishing and happiness. Mill thinks is normally just a way that, and Bentham thinks that this is normally just a way to defend superstition and tradition. Yeah, rights, it's people in power who claim to have rights, Mill and Bentham think, and it's used by those in power to defend their privileges. So Bentham and the radicals, and I think Mill following on for them, thought that appeals to rights were often just a way to protect traditional interests. And so like the radicals, Mill is superstitious of appeals to rights, because it's just appealing to unjustified intuitions and feelings. Appeals to rights, Mill thinks, is always just subjective. So he thinks that really what's important is utility, happiness. But he says, I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions. Yeah, but it must be utility in the largest sense, happiness in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interest of man as a progressive being. The permanent interests of man as a progressive being. Now, I take it that many people who appeal to utilitarianism, just appeal to preferences. Yep. So if you look at modern economics is based on a sort of Benthamite utilitarianism. Each individual has a set of preferences, and then the good thing about capitalism is that it maximizes some optimality in preference satisfaction. Yep. So modern economics has this idea of what's good is satisfying our individual preferences. And Mill thinks that individual preferences are important, but Mill's got a much more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between preferences and what's good. Because our preferences normally, very often, just reflect the norms of our society. And our preferences are things that change and develop in time as we have experience. Yep. And in some sense, he thinks that what's important about freedom is that we give people freedom so that people can experiment and decide what preferences to have. So Mill is a utilitarian who thinks that preferences are important, but preferences are things that have a history and change over time and develop. And that our preferences are rooted in what's good for us, our interests. Yeah, but our preferences don't always line up with our interests. And as we kind of grow and acquire more practical wisdom, our preferences in some sense align better with our interests. And so Mill thinks that we have no a priori armchair way of discovering what is really in the interest of a human being. What is it to have a good life? Well, there is something which it is to have a good life. Some lives are better than others, but we don't find out what it is to have a good life sitting in our armchairs and doing a priori philosophy. But we discover what it is to have a good life by learning from our society and from others, from custom, but then also by engaging in sort of experiments of living. Yeah, to discover what it is to live well, we've got to go out there and live. Yeah, and as we go out there and live, we sort of discover more deeply what's involved in having a good human life. Yeah, so yeah, this is the idea. Now, yeah, so he thinks that, let's jump into chapter 3. That's the introduction. So in chapter 3, in chapter 2, he's talking about freedom of speech, that society should not interfere in other people's speech. And then he says, let us next examine whether the same reasons do not require that men should be free to act on their opinions, carry out in their lives without hindrance, either physical or moral, from their fellow men, so long as it is their own risk and peril. So should individuals just be left to decide how to live their lives without interference from others? And Mill's argument is yes, even if we think other people are wasting their lives or leading lives that we think are immoral, individuals should be allowed the society should be encouraged to be a society in which individuals do this. And the question is, so we've got this defense of a sort of liberalism where the state and society in some sense remains neutral about what it is to have a good life, doesn't interfere either politically or in terms of public opinion into the lives of others, is a society that is open and receptive to eccentricity. So he thinks a flourishing, and the argument is going to be that such a society that encourages and values eccentricity and difference and pluralism, is going to be a society that over time is most likely to flourish. So if we care about human flourishing, and we understand that individual human beings are imperfect judges of what it is to lead a good life, and that as philosophers, we can't tell you a priori what it is to have the best life. Yeah, that's something philosophy can't tell us. But we can make discoveries. There is some truth with a small t about values, about what it is to have a good life, that we can discover through action. So and the reason for this, there's a number of reasons. So he says, the liberty of the individual must thus far be limited. So the only limits on the liberty of the individual, he must not make himself a nuisance to other people. But if he refrains from molesting others in what concerns them, and merely acts according to his own inclination and judgment in things concerning himself, reasons which show that opinion should be free prove also that he should be allowed without molestation to carry his opinions into practice at his own cost. And the reason for this, here we've got an argument, that mankind are not infallible, that their truths for the most part are only half-truths. Yeah, that unity of opinion, unless resulting from the fullest and freest comparison of opposite opinions, so we need freedom. I mean, there's an epistemic argument here for freedom to live our own lives. Yeah, that freedom has an epistemic value because if we don't have free space for ideas, we're unlikely to arrive at truth. Unless resulting from the fullest and freest comparisons of opinions is not desirable, and diversity is not an evil but a good, until all mankind are much more capable than at present of recognizing all sides of the truth. These are principles applicable to men's mode of action, no less than to their opinions. And it is useful that while mankind are imperfect, there should be different opinions. So a plurality of opinions is good because this is going to help us arrive at truth. It's going to help us sharpen our own opinions. It's going to turn dead dogmas into living belief. So it is that there should be different experiments in living. Yeah, that free scope should be given to the varieties of character, short of injury to others. And that the worth of different modes of life should be proved practically when when anyone thinks fit to think them. So once again, there's this sort of quite Hegelian attack on abstract ethical thought, abstract moral thinking. When we're thinking about what to do abstractly, we just have an abstract conception of something. Yeah, an abstract conception of a particular mode of living is really quite different from actually living that life. Yeah, so we discover what lives are worth living by living them. Yeah, morality, ethical thought cannot be an abstract a priori enterprise. Yeah, that we discover moral truths about what's good by living particular lives. Yeah, and we don't have to live every life ourselves because other people around us live their lives, and we can learn from mistakes. So we can learn from the mistakes of others and the successes of others about how to live their lives. Yeah, but we sort of discover what sort of lives are good and which ones are problematic through experience. So it's desirable, in short, that in things which do not primarily concern others, individuality should assert itself. Yeah, where not the personal character, but the traditions or customs of other people are the rule of conduct. If you live in a society where everyone's expected in some sense to live traditionally, there is lacking, wanting here, wanting means lack, there is lacking one of the principal ingredients of human happiness. Yeah, and quite the chief ingredient of individual and social progress. So a free society that encourages people to live lives in an uncustomary way, or is open to this, first of all, it's going to be central to being happy. So if we care about individual happiness, freedom is going to be important. But also freedom is the chief ingredient of individual and social progress. So if we care about happiness, individual happiness, then we should value freedom. And if we care about individual and social progress, yeah. And Mill, of course, by talking about happiness, utility of man as a progressive being, thinks that politically we should value two things: happiness and progress. And it's going to turn out at the end of this, he looks at the tension between freedom and progress, because we might think that if we want progress, the best way to do this is forcing certain norms on people to make them progress. And Mill ultimately thinks that for real progress, liberty in the long run is the best strategy for progress as well as individual flourishing. So let's have a 10-minute break. And then after the break, if you've got any questions about what we've looked at so far, then let me know. And then I'll try and finish talking about this chapter on individuality. And if we've got time, I'll start talking about nature. Okay, bye-bye. let's get started again. Yeah, so like Hegel, I think Mill is concerned about the sort of tension and relationship between individual judgment and tradition. And like Hegel, he's reacting against a generation that was sort of very anti-tradition. So you have an aspect of the Enlightenment that just sees all tradition as superstition. Yeah. So, you know, Bentham, the traditional norms of society are just superstition. We just got to throw out the past and start again from scratch. You know, Bentham's a bit like the sort of Pol Pot of utilitarianism. It's like we have to start with year zero, throw out the past. Let's build our norms up from the bottom. And I think Mill, like Hegel, both have a sort of more nuanced view about tradition. Yeah, so they think that on the one hand, yeah, no one's idea of excellence in conduct is that people should do absolutely nothing but copy one another. So even the strongest defender of tradition is going to think, well, we don't just think that people just should copy one another. No, you might think in some societies there are certain aspects where you just have certain rituals that are copied and passed down, and what's important is learning the rituals. So you might think there's a very extreme form of conservatism where to live well is just to copy a set of rituals from the previous generation. I think that's a sort of limit of a sort of absolute valuation of tradition. And I think Mill thinks that no conservatives in the modern world are committed to such a radical view. On the other hand, though, he thinks, and here I think he's saying it's absurd, but I think he's poking Bentham and poking his father. He said it would be absurd to pretend that people ought to live as if nothing whatsoever had been known in the world before they came into it. Yeah. As if experience had yet done nothing towards showing that one mode of existence or conduct is preferable to another. So he thinks that the norms of our societies at least partially reflect centuries of experience. And the experience we find in the norms of our society has got to do with what sorts of things are preferable to one another. Yeah, so, you know, that what sort of things are preferable to one another. If you care about utility and you care about preferences, then you've got a question of which sort of things are preferable for one another. And Mill thinks that this is something we have to discover. Which things are preferable, we have to discover. And so the norms of our societies, at least partially, contain the wisdom of generations about what sort of things in life are preferable to one another, what sort of things are preferable. Now, of course, I've mentioned before, one problem with norms is that often they reflect class, gender interests. They don't reflect what's preferable for living one's life, but they reflect what's to the benefit of those in power. So one thing about norms is that sometimes norms contain wisdom of ages, but partially norms reflect class interests. Yeah, but even insofar as customs and traditions do reflect some genuine practical knowledge. So the sort of idea is that norms and traditions contain some sort of practical knowledge. This sort of practical knowledge is going to be, there's going to be some problems with it. Yeah, so he says the traditions and customs of other people are to an extent evidence of what their experience has taught them. And it's presumptive evidence. Yeah, so if someone says this is a good thing to do, then unless you've got some reason to reject it, yeah, I think epistemically, let's take other people's claims about what's good at face value, unless you've got a reason to object to it. Yeah, let's take, if your parents say, oh, this is a good thing to do, let's you've got good reasons to assume they're right. So the fact that other people tell you that something is a good thing to do is presumptive evidence for it. Now, of course, one of your friends may say, listen, this ride at the fun fair is really good. But it's like, listen, I've done fun fair rides. I'm terrified. I'll just vomit. Yeah. So, you know, that it may turn out that yeah. So the evidence of other people about what it's good to do in life, the claims that other people make about values are claims to a certain type of practical knowledge, and the claims of others have some presumptive evidence. We should treat the claims of others about what has value as not completely worthless. Now, so if someone says this is a good thing to do, yeah, but that, and as such have a claim to his deference. But here's the problem. In the first place, their experience may be too narrow, yeah, or they may not have interpreted it rightly. So if you've got someone who's just lived in a small village and they tell you this is a really good way to live your life, you might think, well, you know, your experience of all the options, you haven't really got, yeah. So it might be that, you know, someone coming from one type of environment, it might be too narrow. So I think we often get this in the kind of move to urban environments. So when people move from rural to urban settings, you have these sort of rural norms about how to live one's life that may be suitable for small communities in which you know everyone by name and you see them every day. But these sort of norms may not be the kind of appropriate norms in a large, anonymous urban environment. So one thing about the experience is that the experience may be too narrow, or the people may have interpreted their experience wrongly. A lot of people are really stupid. Yeah, they have some sort of experience and then say, oh, this is, and it's like, no, you just misunderstand yourself or why you enjoyed it. Secondly, that their interpretation may be correct, but they may be unsuitable to you. So one thing about Mill is he recognizes human diversity. Even within a single environment, say an urban environment, some people may be extroverts, some people may be introverts. And the sort of thing that's good for Atesh may not be good for Zeynep. You know, just because you've got different characters. Yeah. And so yeah, their interpretation of experience may be correct, but unsuitable for him. Customs are made for customary circumstances and customary characters. And his circumstances or his character may be uncustomary. Yep, so customs are made for a particular circumstances and character. Now, I think when it comes to plurality, it may be that there's different type of people as well. So I mentioned introverts and extroverts, but in general, you know, it turns out that human beings are quite different, and what's good for one type of person may be different, really different from others. And I think often when people appeal to tradition, there's a sort of an idea of the sort of uniformity of human character. And if one reason we might question certain aspects of the wisdom of tradition is if we recognize something like plurality of characters. Yeah, so, you know, and it might be in a modern society that different subgroups in some sense appeal to people with different characters. Yeah, so, you know, if you've got a society where you've got the pop kids and you've got the goth kids, the sort of mopey the mopey introverts can kind of get all gothy, and the extroverts can kind of go and dance to Tarkan. I don't know. But the sort of idea is that, yeah. And thirdly, and this is something where this is it plays a big role in his argument for freedom of speech as well. Even though customs be both good as customs and suitable to him, yet conformity to custom merely as custom does not educate or develop him in him any of the qualities which are the distinctive endowments of a human being. So there's going to be a certain value to the fact that you've freely chosen something. Yeah, and that you're freely having chosen something is going to be, there's going to be a certain good to that. So there's a particular way of life, and it may be a way of life that's suitable to you. But if you've only chosen that way of life because it's the only option out there, because that's what everyone else does, then in some sense you haven't chosen it freely. And so there's some specific value for having freely chosen to lead your life in a certain way. And I take it part of this is that there are certain faculties that only get exercised in free choice. So he says the human faculties of perception, judgment, discriminative feeling, mental activity, and even moral preference are exercised only in making a choice. He who does anything because it is custom makes no choice. If you only do something because that's what's expected of you, and it's not a free choice, then you don't develop these capacities of moral perception, of judgment, of discrimination. And in certain sense, you can be making the same choice, but not in the same way. And so in terms of leading your life, it's not just important what you choose, but it's also going to be important how you choose it. And you're only going to be able to choose to live a customary life freely if other options are really available to you. I mentioned one of my friends from university made a documentary about the Amish. And I think it won an Oscar about 10 years ago. Was it nominated? I can't remember. But it's called Devil's Playground. So you have these Amish kids, and when they get to 18, the Amish are a Protestant sect who believe in adult baptism. So you have to freely choose to be a Christian when you're an adult. And so they actually, when their children get to the age of 18, they force them to leave the community. And they sort of go out into New Jersey. You know, the Amish ride horses. They don't have electricity. They don't have telephones. They don't have buttons. They live this very 17th. And then they force these kids out to live in the world. And they all go off into New Jersey and kind of become meth heads and drug addicts. And they're completely incapable of living in the modern world. But the sort of idea is that you have to go out and experience the secular world in order to freely choose this sort of traditional lifestyle. And they think it's really important that in somehow they want their kids to live this traditional life, but they also want them to freely choose it. Atesh.
Do you think he's overlooking the historical factor on individual choices? Because it seems to me that the individual has a say in how they want to lead their life, but it's more or less from a few choices, like just going on with the public opinion or rejecting it in some way, but there has to be this starting points, you know.
Yeah, so he says, oh, we learn from experience. And so one thing you might look at, so Mill is kind of wants a society in which it sort of values eccentricity. He's living in a sort of conservative Victorian world where people are frowning on people. You know, he had this scandalous sexual relationship. He fell in love with this woman who was married, and and he's just like, well, these sort of things a society shouldn't interfere in. I guess you might think things like lifestyle choices, like gay marriage. That's going to be something that's outside of the purview. But Victorian social life was very conservative and judgmental in these ways. But then you might think one thing we've learned might be about the sort of commodification of freedom of choice. So we live on this world, in the modern world, where in some sense, it seems like there's lots of freedom, but the sort of freedom is a choice, you might think, between these sort of pre-packaged identities. And so you might think, yeah, what would Mill make of, the TikTok generation? Yeah, or, where there is a sort of valuing of sort of individuality, but it's this very sort of superficial individuality, and it's sort of pre-packaged, and there's various options on the sort of cultural supermarket that you can choose between. Is this, I mean, in some sense, I think he's going to say, well, that's sort of better than a uniform conservatism. But does the culture really promote experiments in living? I mean, I don't know, if you look at the sort of modern internet world, it's very judgmental and in some sense tries that there is a sort of uniformity to judgment that sort of, so I think Mill would sort of be worried about these trends. I think that he's talking before you've got this sort of mass media in the same way and the internet, but I mean, towards the end of this chapter, he's got this big, so yeah, so I think you were talking about the sort of, I thought you were talking about something like the commodification of freedom.
Yeah, like
yeah.
I think like today there isn't one public opinion that dominates, but a few public opinions that you need to choose from, but nothing else. I mean, the
Yeah,
individual.
so you might think at this sort of 1980s American high school movie, like you can either be a jock or a sort of cool girl, a cheerleader girl, or you can be a sort of, I don't know, there's kind of 7 options. And you know, if you don't fit into any of those, that's it. You're sort of socially dead. Yeah, I think he'd be worried about that because yeah, so there's this quite famous passage here that I think is quite funny. So he says that he who lets the world or his own portion of it choose his plan of life for him has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. Yeah, so he's sort of against a sort of world that is just going to kind of value this ape-like faculty of imitation. So, you know, he's got this very Aristotelian view of flourishing, whereas flourishing involves developing your capacities. And so a sort of a world that just is based on imitation. And you might think, yeah, like suppose you've got like 3 or 4 identities open for you and they're pre-packaged. You might think there that all you're doing is imitating. So it's imitating between options doesn't seem to give you any real benefit, at least on this. It might mean that you're able, it might be better than imitating just one thing. So having a plurality of options may mean that, you know, their interpretation of experience may be correct but unsuitable to him. So it means that, you know, if there are different characters, at least if you've got a bunch of different pre-packaged options out there, it's going to be more likely that one of the, given human diversity, it's going to be more likely that one of the options may be better for you. So that might be a good thing. I think, yeah, so he's got this, I mean, he's got this idea that it's, I mean, this is the sort of more Nietzschean side where he thinks that a society needs to make room for sort of genius, yeah, and for creators of new values. Yeah, so one thing that's going to be really important is going to be creativity and originality. But once again, though, I think we look at the modern world and you may think, well, kind of originality has just been commodified. It's just one more, you know, and now you've got these people who are just trying to be different. And sort of, is that, you know, once again, you might think that Mill is going to find this sort of problematic. I think Mill does think that happiness is important. So I think one thing is that there may be certain ways of life that are encouraged that just clearly mean that people aren't flourishing. Yeah. So yeah. So my guess is he wouldn't be a particular fan of the kind of influencer modern thing. Yeah, so he has an interesting attack here on the, yeah, so so one thing is he who chooses his plan for himself employs all his faculties. So one thing is it's not that choice by itself is good, but choice is good because if you're freely choosing, you're employing all of your faculties. Yeah, so making your own decisions in life, being an adult rather than a child, you know, you must use your observation to see, reasoning, judgment to foresee. You must kind of use your activity to gather materials for decision, discrimination. You need firmness and self-control. And that these are kind of qualities that need to be exercised in order to develop. Yeah, so in a society that values freedom, these sort of capacities are going to get exercised. Whereas a society that doesn't value freedom, and so what's important isn't the freedom of choice, but the way in which a society that encourages freedom allows these sort of faculties to be developed in individuals. So it's possible that he might be guided in some good path and kept out of harm's way, but without any of these things. But what will be his comparative worth as a human being? Yeah, and I think he thinks that a life of imitation is not really a fully human life. Yeah, so he says it is really of importance not only what men do, but also what manner of men they are that do it. So he says, amongst the works of man, which human life is rightly employed in perfecting and beautifying, the first importance surely should be man himself. So he thinks that to live well is a sort of involves self-perfection and self-beautification, the creation of beauty. This is kind of, I think, where Nietzsche and there's a sort of aesthetic side to living well that only comes with freedom. And you have this idea of self-beautification. So he says, supposing that it were possible to get houses built, corn grown, battles fought, causes tried, and even churches erected and prayers said by machinery. So suppose you could automate all of human life and then abolish. So let's suppose you think what's really important is praying 5 times a day. You might think, well, wouldn't the best thing be to abolish human beings and just build robots who pray 5 times a day? Yeah. Well, and Mill would say that just doesn't have any value. Getting a robot to pray 5 times a day, that's not, yeah. So let's suppose we built automatons that could do all of these things that we think have value. Yep. It would be a considerable loss to exchange for these automatons, even the men and women who at present inhabit the more civilized part of the world and who assuredly are but starved specimens of what nature can and will produce. So modern human beings are a sort of stepping stone, but it's much better to be an imperfect human being than a perfect robot. Yeah, and in some sense, that human beings are, because human beings are a progressive nature, that in some sense, Mill is looking to the men and women of the future who will have even better lives than ours. You might think of kind of Nietzsche's Superman. Yeah, the idea of modern human beings as a sort of bridge. And human nature, so this is going to be central, human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed to it, but a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides according to the tendency of the inward forces that make it a living thing. So we've got this sort of organic view of the human, and like a tree, what's going to be important is human flourishing. And I mean, this is sort of Mill's more romantic side. So he comes back to this imagery on page 127, and he talks about this kind of Calvinist traditional moralistic Christianity that was dominant in Victorian England. And one of the things, have any of you ever read anything or know anything about the history of gardening? History of gardens? So think about the move from a classical garden to a romantic garden. Yeah, so in the classical period, what did they like in gardens? Any sort of ideas? Yeah, it was all very organized, and there was this sort of idea of sort of dominating nature. You would cut all of the hedges into perfect shapes. You know, you have these hedges, and they'll cut them into the shapes of birds. You'll have mazes, and you'll have lots of straight lines. Yeah, the Romantics sort of valued a certain type of wildness. Yeah, so if you look at the emergence of romantic gardening, that you have these wildernesses, you have ruins there. Yeah, it's all a bit chaotic. That you have sort of individual trees. It's sort of there's a sort of encouragement of individuality in the sort of romantic garden, and Mill comes back to this kind of idea of the tree. So he says, in some such insidious form, there is at present a strong tendency to this narrow theory of life. Yeah, so we have this narrow theory of life, constrained theory, to the pinched and hidebound type of human character which it patronizes. Many persons, no doubt, sincerely think that human beings thus cramped and dwarfed. These are the people cramped and dwarfed by the sort of morality of this Protestant morality of denial, are as their maker designed them to be. Just as many have thought that trees are a much finer thing when clipped into pollards or cut into figures of animals than as nature made them. Yeah, so a pollard, I was just looking for that word I was going to. So pollarding is sort of, yeah, is sort of cutting them into very organized shapes. Yeah, cutting them into shapes of animals. Yep, but if it be any part of religion to believe that man was made by a good being, it is more consistent with that faith to believe that this being gave all human faculties that they might be cultivated and unfolded. Yep, so if we believe God is good, this is sort of an appeal to the religious, then we should think that God has created beings to grow. Yeah, it's basically good, and that humans have been given their faculties so they may be cultivated, unfolded, and allowed to grow, not rooted out and consumed. And that God takes delight in every nearer approach made by his creatures to the ideal conception embodied in them. Yeah, every increase in any of their capacities of comprehension, of action, or of enjoyment. Yeah, that there is a different type of human excellence. There is a different type of human excellence from the Calvinist, a conception of humanity as having its nature bestowed on it for other purposes than merely to be abnegated, to be denied. Pagan self-assertion is one of the elements of human wealth, as well as Christian self-denial. There is a Greek ideal of self-development, which the Platonic and Christian ideal of self-government blends with, but does not supersede. It may be better to be John Knox than Alcibiades. John Knox is like one of the founders of Scottish Protestantism, and the Scottish Protestants had the reputation for being the most miserable, the most dour, the most grim. Yeah, so John Knox is the leader of this pleasure denying. Alcibiades was the student of Socrates who became a traitor and was known as a sort of hedonist crazy. So if you're given a choice between self-control and being a psychopath, self-control is better. But it's better to be a Pericles than to be either. Once again, we've got this pagan ideal of Pericles. He was the kind of great orator, the great statesman, the great creator of values. And nor would a Pericles, if we had one, be without anything good which belonged to John Knox. So Pericles kind of contains all of the goods of Christian self-control. Yeah. And so, yeah. So this is, and so Atesh, you asked about choice. So living in a society that allows us to choose is good for Mill insofar as it's a sort of society that promotes individual self-development, that allows individuals to flourish, to grow. And so I think he thinks that the mere existence of choice is not really the central thing. Yeah, it's not like he values choice for its own sake, but a society that sort of values sort of growth, that in some sense values character, that you know, that these sort of Christians, these sort of 19th century Christians, so we're coming back to page 125, that take desires and impulses as dangerous. So there's a certain view of our desires and impulses as dangerous things to be controlled. Yeah, and so whenever we come across a strong desire, we sort of stand back in fear. And Mill thinks that a healthy society is one that sort of encourages people to act on their desires and impulses and to make them their own. Yeah. So he says desires and impulses are as much a part of a perfect human being as beliefs and restraints. Yep. And strong impulses are only dangerous, are only perilous when not properly balanced. Yeah. When one set of aims and inclinations is developed into strength, while others which ought to coexist remain weak and inactive. So it's not because men's desires are strong that they act badly. It's because their conscience are weak. So he thinks there's a sort of, I mean, like Nietzsche, I think he's attacking the Christian morality of his own day, which is a morality of self-denial. And this morality of self-denial just sees desires, passions as the enemy that needs to be rooted out. And he thinks that he says there's no natural connection between strong impulses and weak conscience. Yeah. So he's into promoting a society that promotes energy. Yeah. So he says strong impulses are but another name for energy. Energy may be turned to bad uses, but more good may always be made of an energetic nature than an indolent or impassive one. And so, yeah, so yeah, and so what we should have in society is that a flourishing society is one that encourages the emergence of passions and desires. So he says the same strong susceptibilities which make the personal impulses vivid and powerful are also the source from whence are generated the most passionate love of virtue and the sternest self-control. It is through the cultivation of these. So once again, we have this image of cultivation, which is this organic, you know, what you cultivate a tree, yeah, you cultivate a living being. That society both does its duty and protects its interest, not by rejecting the stuff of which heroes are made, because it knows not how to make them. And this is an important thing. So he says, a person whose desires and impulses are his own, yeah, are the expression of his own nature as it has been developed and modified by his own culture, is said to have a character. So he introduces this idea of character. And I take it he thinks that what's important in life is to have a character. And so society should encourage the existence of individual members within it to have character. And to have character, what is it to have character? To have a character means that your desires and impulses are your own. But your desires and impulses are your own means that your desires and impulses are the expression of his own nature as it has been developed and modified by his own culture. Yeah. So in some sense, individuality, he wants to tie this to the existence of character. So what's good in life is to have a character. This is something that Kant says. So this is a very kind of Kantian idea. So Kant thinks that to be autonomous is to rule oneself, is to be subject to your own judgment, not the judgment of others. And he identifies in his anthropology being moral with having a character. Having a character is to be autonomous. It's for your, in some sense, it's an aspect of autonomy anyway. I think it's not full Kantian autonomy, but a person whose desires and impulses are his own is said to have a character. But for one's impulses and character to be one's own, there has to be a sort of harmony between the individual nature and the culture in which it finds itself. Yeah, so and I take it this, once again, this is a kind of quite pagan Greek sort of idea that what's in order to have flourishing society, there needs to be this sort of harmony between the culture and the character of the individual and the essence of the nature of individuals within the society. Yeah, and so I think Mill thinks that the culture in society has to be a sort of culture that encourages individuals to develop character. This is his, yeah. And in order to do this, it's got to be a culture that encourages eccentricity. Yeah. Now, he thinks that many people in life ask themselves, what's suitable for my position? What is usually done by persons of my station and wealth? Or worse still, what is usually done by persons of a station and circumstances superior to mine? Now, so sort of most societies encourage people to think in these sort of terms. This is Mill and Heidegger. Heidegger talks about das Man, what one does. Yeah, we think about what one does in these circumstances. Yeah, and this is yeah, for most people, it doesn't occur to them to have any inclination except for what is customary. Thus, the mind itself is bowed to the yoke. Even in what people do for pleasure, conformity is the first thing thought of. Yeah, they like crowds. They like in crowds. They exercise choice only amongst things commonly done. Peculiarity of taste, eccentricity of conduct are shunned equally with crimes. So in some sense, he like Mill is into peculiarity of taste and eccentricity of conduct. And he thinks in order to have a society in which people can live well, it has to encourage, it has to be open to this. Yeah. And insofar as people just follow the crowd, yeah, until by dint, what happens to these people? By dint of not following their own nature, they have no nature to follow. Yeah, their human capacities are withered and starved. They become incapable of any strong wishes or native pleasures, and are generally without either opinions or feelings of home growth or properly their own. Now, is this or is it not the desirable condition of human nature? And I think Mill thinks that one of the worries he's got about modernity, unlike Hegel, who's a real kind of fan of modernity in the modern world, I think Mill is sort of worried that the modern world, with the ascendancy of public opinion, is going to be even more, at least in the aristocratic world, there was some valuation of eccentricity, of individual character, of sort of genius. With the emergence of mass culture, there's this tendency towards even greater conformity, because now you've got the will of the people, you've got popular opinion. And so the emergence of I think he's very worried that Western culture is going to become this sort of culture in which uniformity and public opinion becomes the sort of dominant. So I think he's a sort of interesting, because Mill is very much into modernity. He's a sort of democratic socialist who's in favor of democracy. But at the same time, I think he's got these romantic worries about the dangers of democratic populism in terms of the tyranny of the majority, but also in the social world, the worry of this sort of uniformity of mass culture. Yeah, so some of these you know, some of these things in the Frankfurt School, I think you can, there's some, yeah, so once again, I'm just running through because we're running out of time. He has some interesting things to say about experiments of living again on page 129. Now, he thinks that not everyone is going to be that creative, but he thinks that there are some people who are kind of particularly creative, and these are people who should be encouraged in society. So is there a form of elitism here? It is true that this benefit is not capable of being rendered by everyone alike. There are but few persons in comparisons with the whole of mankind, whose experiments, if adopted by others, would be likely to be any improvement on established practices. But these few, these individuals who lead new lives that then become paradigms, these, what Nietzsche is going to call the kind of creators of new values, I think these are the sort of people that need to be encouraged. So this is my sort of link between another link between Mill and Nietzsche. He says, but these few are the salt of the earth. Without them, human life would become a stagnant pool. Not only is it they who introduce good things which did not exist before exist, they also keep the life in those which already existed. If there was nothing new to be done, would human intellect seek to be necessary? Would it be a reason why those who do the old things should forget why they are done and do them like cattle, not like human beings? So without these experimenters, Mill thinks, that even if we've discovered the best way of living life, then we'll end up leading the best life like cattle and not like human beings. And then it won't any longer be the best life. There's a sort of paradox in the idea of the best life. And because there's only too great a tendency in the best beliefs and practices to degenerate into the mechanical. Yeah, so there's a sort of worry that for our beliefs and practices to degenerate into the mechanical. We do things without thinking. We just follow what's to be done. And after some time, we find ourselves, in some sense, leading the life of a machine, not the life of, So in some sense, even if you believe you found the best life, so I think he's now appealing to the kind of person who says, no, I know that the kind of the best life is the life of the virtuous Christian or the good Muslim. Yep. He says, well, even so, you still need crazy people out there doing things differently in order that this best life can be lived non-mechanically. Yeah, that you sort of know that it's freely chosen. Yeah. So even if you've discovered, even if you think you know what the best way of living life is, there's still going to be a reason why you need people expressing falsity, people living worse life, for unless there are a succession of persons whose ever recurring originality prevents the grounds of these beliefs and practices from becoming merely traditional. Yes, such dead matter would not resist the smallest shock from anything really alive. And there would be no reason why civilization should not die out, as in the Byzantine Empire. Yeah, persons of genius, it is true, are always likely to be a small minority, but in order to have them, it is necessary to preserve the soil in which they grow. Genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. Persons of genius are more individual than any other people, less capable, consequently, of fitting themselves without hurtful compression into any of the small number of molds which society provides in order to save its members the trouble of forming their own character. So you asked about choice. Yeah, you might think, well, you've got a small number of molds which society provides, which allows us to, in some sense, to have a personality, to have a kind of public face without really forming our own character, without really having, so this is sort of Mill. That originality, creativity, genius that originality is the one thing which unoriginal minds cannot feel the use of. They cannot see what it is to do for them. But all good things were once new. Everything good in human life, human life grows. Everything good, every tradition was created. Yep. So all good things come from an originality. Nothing was ever yet done which someone was not the first to do. And that all good things which exist are the fruits of originality. Yep. And so this is what society needs. And then he's sort of worried that this sort of need for originality and creativity is being undermined by public opinion. Yeah, so at present, individuals are lost in the crowd. In politics, it's almost trivial to say that public opinion now rules the world, that the only power deserving the name is that of masses, of governments, while they make themselves the organ of the tendencies and instincts of the masses. And this is true, yeah, in terms of social relations as well as in the public sphere. Yeah, public opinion, yeah, leads to what is it? Those whose opinions go by the name of public opinion aren't the whole people. They're generally just the middle class or a collective mediocrity, and the masses do not. So I think he's talking about Twitter here. He says the masses now do not take their opinions from dignitaries in church or state, from the ostensible leaders, or from books. Their thinking is done for them by men, much like themselves, addressing them or speaking in their name on the spur of the moment through sort of newspapers. Now, he says, I'm not complaining about all of this. So in some sense, he's a fan of modernity, but he's sort of worried that England, Britain, that was a kind of creative, vibrant culture is going to become stagnant. So he looks at various other countries, and he at the end he looks at China, and he says, China used to be this great civilization that was very creative, and then sort of stagnated. And he's sort of predicting, is sort of worried that unless there is a sort of more love of originality, then European culture is going to stagnate. There's one other Nietzschean point I wanted to point to, that in some sense, custom is always there. We always have institutions, we always have customs, but the creation of new customs is always important. And the creation of new customs is a matter of originality, of genius, of the creation of new values. And this is a theme we're going to look at in Nietzsche, where Nietzsche thinks that what's needed in Europe is a sort of revaluation of values, the creation of new values. So he says, I've said that it's important to give the freest scope possible to uncustomary things, in order that it may in time appear which of these are fit to be converted into customs. So given human nature, we're the sort of being that we can't get rid of customs. We're always beings that are sort of molded by our customs, because our character is a mixture of our nature and our customs. So we don't have any choice to be the sort of beings who live customary, in some sense, customary lives. But we need to be the sort of beings that we give rein to the sort of creation of new customs, the creation of new institutions. And this is going to be necessary in order to live in a sort of dynamic society in which human beings can flourish. And yeah, so, in his society, that this isn't encouraged. So he says, and in particular, I think he thinks with women. So he says, but the man is still the women, more the woman, who can be accused of either doing what nobody does or of not doing what everyone does, is the subject of much depreciatory remark, as if he or she had committed some grave moral delinquency. So, you know, that people get treated like moral criminals for acting, especially women in Victorian society, for acting in ways that are not customary. This is, I think. Now you may think, well, maybe Mill sort of won this fight, and maybe it's gone too far in that direction. I don't know. What do we? I mean, Mill is criticizing the society of his day, which is Victorian England. I wonder what he'd make of 21st century UK, what he'd think of Turkey. I think Turkey maybe is closer to Victorian England in many ways than modern Britain in terms of the sort of conservatism. Okay, I've got to run. I'll see you in class tomorrow. Have fun. And tomorrow we're going to start talking about Nietzsche. So I'm going to start talking about book 1 of the Genealogy of Morals. Yeah, so that should be fun. Okay, ciao.